In this tutorial, I'd like to take you through the process of listening to sonata form. You learn sonatinas at a particular stage, and then you graduate to sonatas, which are larger forms to deal with. When we say sonata, we're typically talking about something that's in multiple movements, multiple single pieces that a composer has intentionally written together to be a complete work. Sonata form refers to how any one of those movements might be structured. Not every single one. Typically it's the first movement of a sonata. In this case, I'm using an example by Haydn. It's the last movement, the finale of the Sonata in G major, which is a current selection for the ABRSM Grade 6 syllabus. So ideally, if you're at that level or you're familiar with this piece or you have a score of this piece, you will get the most out of this tutorial if you're following along while I play. You can still hear the key relationships that I'm going to be talking about and some of the cadences and so forth, but if you have the score in front of you, that's ideal. So let me talk you through some of the terminology that you need to know in order to follow along more easily. Sonata form basically has three sections. The first is an exposition. Basically, the ideas of the sonata are exposed, they're introduced, followed by a development where those ideas are taken through some permutations, maybe some different keys, and then the recapitulation, which sounds like the piece is starting over again, but it necessarily has to finish differently in order to end on the tonic key that the piece is in. In some cases, you'll also have a coda at the end, sort of wrapping things up and providing an extra idea at the end. This piece is in G major, so I'm going to talk you through different keys that it goes through, and the way that happens is we'll hear cadences, which are endings of phrases that will then take us to different keys, depending on what Haydn wants to do in any given section. So when we move from key to key, that's called a modulation. If we start in G major and go to D major, for example, add a C sharp and we end up in D major, that's a modulation. Another term that I'll use is the idea of sequence. When you hear a pattern, and so forth. Simply goes down by step or up by step and stays within a key or actually slightly changes notes in order to get us to a new key. So the use of cadences, the use of sequences to give us modulations which take us to different keys, which is how we relate one section to the next. That's what we're listening for. So that was an overall view of what's happening in sonata form. Now let me take you through the things to listen for in this piece. The piece is in G major, so we start with a phrase in G major. I'm playing slightly under tempo, because when I'm playing and talking, I'm not just listening to how I want it to sound, I'm also thinking of what I'm going to say next. So it's less of a disaster if I just slow down a little bit. There's that first moment that I wanted to arrive to. It's clearly the end of our first musical thought, which is what we call a cadence. It's a cadence that ended on the dominant. We started here. That's our G chord, that's the tonic. Our first phrase ends on the dominant. So we call that an imperfect cadence, or a half cadence, as we say in the US. Haydn does that exact moment, that exact little turn of phrase 3 times in this piece. Right where I stopped at measure 10, Again in measure 60, if you want to look forward towards that measure, and right away again in 66. These are pivotal moments in the piece where he decides to do 3 different things. So I said we've just arrived on the 5 chord. What he decides to do next is stay on the 5 chord, but he's added a C sharp. Basically, moment to moment, we've modulated to D major. And we have some broken D major chords following that. So that's a very quick way to pivot from G major to D major. The reason he does that is the exposition then is going to also end in D major. Here's the last 4 measures. You'll notice it doesn't sound like it's leaving us hanging anymore like an imperfect cadence. It sounds like it's the end of that section. Even if in the back of our minds we realize it's not really where we started. So listening to the end of these sections is a little bit like listening to a cadence, but you're testing your musical memory. Can I hear how this end of the section relates to the beginning of the piece? So, we turn the page, we're going to the development. We've just arrived in D major. A very typical feature of the development is that the composer will start over with the opening theme, but simply stated in the new key. And that's exactly what Haydn does here. Here's the first theme, but starting in D major. Sounded very familiar. It was exactly the same start, but here we've got something that's going to take us somewhere else. And that's another feature of the development. The idea is literally that the composer is taking an idea or two and permutating it, modulating through different keys, just so we can hear how it sounds in this new key, or how does this key relate to another key before we arrive back at the beginning. So I'll play through bits and pieces of the development. We've just arrived here. So you could probably hear I was playing a sequence. There's that other term that I used. It was a longer idea. Step lower, step lower, and in this case, each step is adding some new notes to the scale so that we arrive here. This also sounded like a perfect cadence, like we had arrived at a new tonic, and we have. If you heard where the scales took you in that sequence, you now know we're in E minor. It might seem, well, why would we start in D major and go to E minor? But if we realize we started in G major, we went to the tonic, so those are closely related chords and keys. We started in G major, and in the development, we worked our way to E minor. That's the relative minor. Another typical goal when you modulate in sonata form in the classical period. Tonic to dominant, tonic to relative minor. So here we are in E minor in the middle of the development. What's going to happen next? Oh, that sounded like our opening theme. But it isn't settled. It's also going to become a sequence and take us somewhere different. and you could hear another sequence as I arrived there. So remember the first time we went from this and just launched into that new key area of D major. Here, Haydn realizes, okay, I've pretty much come to the end of this development section. I'm going to use this cadence to go somewhere else. And in fact, it turns around and goes back to the beginning. So you see this pivotal moment, what we often call the pivot chord. It is our cadence in this case, but it's taking us different places. So I'll play that moment again. There it is our third time. So that opening phrase, he truncated it slightly. That opening phrase was not 10 measures like it was the first time. Here it's only 6 when I've just arrived on this cadence. So here it is again. There's that moment. And here's the third direction we go. So similar, but here he's staying in the tonic. The 5 chord leads us back to 1. So this is our recapitulation. We're starting over, but that one moment changes so that then we can finish the piece. It sounds just like the first section, but you hear everything in the tonic key instead of the dominant key of D major. So I hope this has been instructive. Take out your score, play through things that I've demonstrated for you, listen to what they sound like, compare different moments in the piece, and you'll have a better grasp of sonata form.